So up until now, our React components have been really simple. We've really just been returning static text to the UI. And in this lesson, we're going to move on to building slightly more complex components, which actually store state. So state enables us to store property values that belong to a component. So in the application that we're building, this property value is going to be our dimension value that we're going to be incrementing through on each button click. And in this lesson, we're going to create a number and just increment up a number by clicking a button. So one thing to note about state is that when the state object changes, the component re-renders. So if you think about it, it makes sense that if we're displaying our dimension values on the screen and we want to increment through those values, that on that click of a button, in order to show that new dimension value, the component will need to re-render. So just keep that in mind as we work through and also work through more complex components, is that the components will re-render whenever that state changes. So we store state in components using the useState function. And useState is a function that comes from our React module. So let's take a look at it in a bit more detail. I'm going to create a const called state, which equals react.useState. And then I'm going to console log state. I'm going to remove our array console just to clean up our console a little bit. Okay, so we've console logged this state's const, which is set to our useState function. And you can see it returns an array of two values. The first is undefined, the second is a function. So this first is our initial state value. The second is a function that we can call to update this state value. So if I set this to 0, you can see our initial state here is set to 0, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, changes to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we know we can get hold of this first value by the square braces and 0 to return that. And similarly, in our JSX, we can use the curly braces and just return that state value to our UI. Now keep in mind that we can store lots of different state objects in a component, and it's not always convenient to be using this or similar syntax and destructuring every time. So we can actually destructure here when setting our initial variables. And we can do that by adding square brackets, because we know useState is returning an array. And let's call the initial state object, in this case index. And we can also name our function that we can call to update this index state. And then I'm going to use the syntax here of just set index. You can call this anything, and adding set before the const name is best practice, and you'll see that in many examples in React. So this state no longer exists, so we can set index and index. Oh, sorry, not set index, index, and then we can return index. So we're showing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 now on our UI. Let's remove this console log, and I'm going to set this back to 0. Notice we've accessed the useState function from the React module. We don't actually need to write React dot every single time. We can just add curly braces up here and add useState on our imports and remove it. And that will all work as just as previously. Okay, so in this lesson also what we want to do is add a button, and on click of this button we want to increment through this number, and we can actually show the state object in action. So I'm going to add a button, and we know that comes with a on-click property, and we notice the camel casing here for on-click. I'm going to call this next, and we can call I'm going to call a function in this called counter, and this is going to have the logic for the increment. So function of counter, and I'm just going to console log that just to demonstrate. And I've missed a C. And then when you click next, you can see called being returned in our console. So instead of this, we want to update our state object. So we can do that by calling setIndex. Nice and easy, as we know, we can set that to whatever we want, maybe 100, and you can click this and it jumps to 100. We actually know we want to increment, so instead I'm going to set it to our index initial value plus 1. And now when we click, it is actually incrementing, so that number is increasing on every click, and by refreshing the page that jumps back down to 0. Now in our final application, we're going to want to increment through the values in our hypercube, which means we don't really want to keep incrementing past the 9th, because we know there are 10 values in our array, so here they'll be from number 0 to 9. So we need a conditional expression here. So if index is less than 9, then we want to increment, otherwise we want to set index to 0. And instead of hard coding 9, we can grab the length of our data object, because obviously that could change in the future. So if index is less than something, do this, otherwise set index to 0. And this something here is going to be the length of our data object. So we can use object.keys data.length. So if index is less than the length of our data object, which is going to be 10, and we want a -1 because we're incrementing from 0 to 9, so we don't actually want to hit 10 in our increment. So if this is the case, then let's increment up, otherwise set it back down to 0. And then if we refresh this and click next, you can see we're incrementing up to 9 and then back to 0. So when we enhance this in our next lesson, we'll actually be returning here our dimension value. So useState is actually the first example of a React hook that we're using. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about React hooks before we close this lesson. So before the introduction of hooks, you could only include state in a class component. So functional components were not able to store any state. So they're only used for really simple, very simple components. But hooks enables us to store state in functional components, so there's no need now to write class components. We will have a lesson on class components, because if you are reviewing any old React code, there's a good chance that you will see them in action. But in this course, we'll only ever really be writing functional components using React hooks. So it's a lot simpler way of getting started, and we can achieve the same functionality as with class components. So useState is the first hook that I've introduced you to, and is the simplest, and as we know, it's used for storing an initial state and also updating that state. So we're going to move on to a second hook called useEffect in the next lesson, and then some more React hooks as we go on in the next section of the course. So I will include the link to this page if you want to just do some reading on React hooks. So hope you enjoyed this lesson, and next time we're going to be looking at useEffect and actually just finishing our first simple React application.